Welcome to episode 121 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Laws Guy. It's March 1st, 1921, and today's story is not a match, it's an election. A quiet administrative moment, a French lawyer being chosen to lead a fragile organization that ends up changing the entire architecture of the sport. Because on this day, Jules Rimet becomes FIFA president. And once he is in that chair, football stops being a European argument with occasional international guests and starts becoming a global system with a tournament that forces the world to meet itself every 4 years. But how did we get here? By 1921, football is no longer a Victorian experiment. The FA has existed for nearly 60 years. The first international, England versus Scotland, is almost 50 years in the past. Professionalism has been legal in England for more than 3 decades, and league football has had time to become habit. But here's the twist. All of that growth has been national and regional before it becomes truly global. Europe has cups. Britain has an annual home championship ecosystem. South America already has something that looks like a continental identity project, a regional championship that will eventually be known as the Copa America. Meanwhile, the sport is spreading faster than its governance, which is why FIFA is created in 1904, not as the boss of football, more like a necessity. And if you're Belgium, Denmark, France, the Netherlands, Sweden, Switzerland, and the Spanish representatives, and you want internationals without constant disputes, you need a federation. And the home nations, they're not there at the birth. They're already running their own international circuit, and they don't see a need to be governed by a new continental body. So FIFA begins its life with ambition and with a credibility problem. Then comes the Olympics. And this is where international football gets oxygen. London 1908 and Stockholm 1912 give the sport a recurring stage where nations can meet in public under one tournament bracket and call it something bigger than a friendly. But it's still awkward. It's amateurism heavy. It's often dominated by Great Britain. And it's not yet a world championship in anyone's mind. It's football borrowing the Olympics' legitimacy. Then World War I arrives, and football history hits a wall. International football doesn't merely slow down, it fractures. And while today's episode is not about the war itself, the human tragedy is too large to turn into a football footnote, the football consequence matters. The sport's international machinery breaks, competitions stop, travel stops, and federations struggle. And in 1918, FIFA's president, Daniel Burley-Woolfall, passes away. FIFA nearly collapses. It survives largely because one man, Karl Hirschmann, keeps it alive, almost like a caretaker keeping a museum open through a blackout. So by the time the world begins to restart, FIFA is alive, but barely. And then comes Antwerp, 1920, the first post-war Olympics. International football returns to a tournament format, and it doesn't return as a tidy, everyone agrees what it is product. It returns as chaos. Great Britain, the Olympic champions of 1908 and 12, are knocked out immediately by Norway. Belgium win gold in a final that becomes infamous, abandoned mid-match after Czechoslovakia walk off in protest. Spain appear at this stage now too, and the map of serious football nations begins to widen. It's not a blowout Olympics, it's a messy one, which, in a strange way, is the point. Because football is now too big to be governed by vibes and bilateral agreements. It needs a center, it needs a plan. And this is the moment Jules Rimet enters the story as more than a French administrator. So now let's talk about Rimet. He isn't born into football power. He's the son of a grocer from eastern France who moves to Paris as a boy and becomes a lawyer. And then he becomes something that football history produces again and again, an organizer. At 24, he helps found Red Star in Paris, and he builds it on a principle that feels almost political: sport, without class barriers. That matters because it tells you what kind of football man he is. Not a romantic about tradition, but a builder who believes sport can be social glue. And then the war happens, and it hardens his worldview. Football, to Rimet, isn't only competition, it can be reconciliation. By 1919, he's leading the newly formed French Football Federation. So when FIFA is wobbling after war, Rimet isn't some outsider lobbying for influence. He's one of the few people in Europe who looks like what FIFA needs: a credible administrator with a philosophy. And in 1920, Around the Antwerp Olympics, he's placed in acting charge of FIFA. And at those games, he floats a radical idea, an international tournament every 4 years. Not merely an Olympic football tournament, a football tournament, a world championship that belongs to the sport itself. The problem? It doesn't get instant applause, because this is a time when the Olympics still feel like the natural world stage, and FIFA still feels like a small federation with limited authority. So Rimet's idea doesn't land like destiny. It lands like a proposal. And in football, proposals only matter if someone can turn them into structure. Which brings us to the day itself, March 1st, 1921. Jules Rimet is elected FIFA president. And if you're looking for the modern drama, the campaign slogans, the rival candidates, the backroom vote counting, this doesn't really read like that. This reads more like a federation choosing the man who has already started doing the job. A confirmation of direction. A decision that says FIFA will not just survive, it will expand, it will govern, and it will eventually build the tournament that forces the sport to become truly global. At the start of Rimet's reign, FIFA is still small, about 20 member countries. By the time he steps down in 1954, it's 85. That's not normal growth. That's a redefinition of who football belongs to. So what did his election mean? Well, first, it meant FIFA becomes a real institution, not just a congress that meets and argues. Under Rimet's era, FIFA professionalizes its own survival. It introduces mechanisms that sound boring, but are actually revolutionary for governance, like standardized control over internationals, record keeping, and even financial levies tied to match receipts that help fund the federation's work. This is how you turn an idea into permanence. And second, it means the Olympic pathway becomes a launch pad and then a springboard. In 1924, Paris hosts the Olympic football tournament organized by FIFA, and football gets one of its greatest world meets the world shocks, Uruguay. And Europe, which has been treating itself as a center of football civilization, discovers it isn't alone. Uruguay win gold, and they do it with a style and composure that changes reputations. Then, in 1928, they do it again in Amsterdam, this time beating Argentina in the final. So now the sport has a problem, and an opportunity at the same time. The Olympics have become the stage where the best teams in the world can collide, but the Olympics are constrained by amateur rules, and football is already turning professional in multiple countries. So the sport needs its own world championship, one that can decide its own eligibility, its own economy, and its own legitimacy. It leads directly to the fateful turn in 1928. At the FIFA Congress in Amsterdam, FIFA decides it will organize its own world championship. That decision doesn't happen because the world naturally demanded it. It happens because Jules Rimet pushed it for years, against resistance. And because people around him, notably Henri Delaunay, and we'll get back to him in another episode when we talk about the Euro, articulate the obvious truth. International football is now too big to live inside the Olympic box. So the World Cup is born as a governance move, a declaration of independence, and Jules Rimet is the man who makes it happen. Then comes the first World Cup, Uruguay 1930. The choice is symbolic and practical. Uruguay are the reigning Olympic champions, and South America has already proven it has elite football. And Uruguay offered to cover travel costs, which matters enormously in an era when getting teams across the Atlantic is a logistical and financial ordeal. Many nations from Europe don't go, some for cost, some for politics, and some for reluctance. But the tournament happens, and once it happens, it can never be uninvented. Football now has its own global summit, a competition that tells every federation on earth, you can join this sport's main story, but you have to qualify for it. Now zoom out to the long arc of Jules Rimet. He stays in office for 33 years. He is so associated with the World Cup that the trophy is renamed for him in 1946, marking the 25th anniversary of his election. And the irony of football history is that the Jules Rimet trophy becomes its own legend, stolen, recovered, stolen again, and ultimately replaced. But the deeper legacy isn't the object, it's the model. Rimet helps create the idea that football has a legitimate global government, and that this government can create a tournament so meaningful that it reorganizes national priorities, economies, calendars, and identities. That's an extraordinary outcome for a man whose main skill was administration. And it's why FIFA later notes that his peace through sport ambition was serious enough to earn him a Nobel Peace Prize nomination. Because Rimet's bet was not only that football could entertain, it was that football could bind nations together through ritualized competition. And whether or not the sport always lives up to that ideal, the World Cup proves that the ritual works. Now, 3 things to take away from March 1st, 1921. First, football's biggest revolutions are often governance revolutions. A vote in a committee room can matter more than a goal, because it decides what goals will mean in the future. Second, the Olympics didn't just showcase football, they exposed football's next need. Once Uruguay arrive and dominate, the sport can't pretend it's only European. A world championship becomes inevitable. And third, Jules Rimet wasn't elected because he had a catchy slogan. He was elected because he had the rare combination of belief and operational discipline, and he was willing to spend years converting resistance into structure. On this day in 1921, Jules Rimet became FIFA president, and football's global era moved from a hope to a program, setting the sport on the road to the World Cup and to a century in which the game becomes the world's shared language. That's all for episode 121 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Lost Guy. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow the show, leave a rating, and share it with a fellow historian. Tomorrow, we go to March 2nd, 1888, and to William McGregor's fateful letter that pulls English clubs into a new idea, a league season, a schedule, and the invention of the Football League. If you got ideas, corrections, or a story you want me to chase, you can always reach me at otd@17lawsguy.com. See you tomorrow.